Module 5, Part 2, Other Related Issues for Resumes. So in this lecture, we're going to talk about some other related issues and questions that come up sometimes with resumes, frequently, and sometimes not so much. And then at the end of the lecture, we're going to look at 5 different sample resumes and talk about each one and see kind of how they look. So sometimes people ask, should I include my GPA on my resume? And if so, should I include my overall or my cumulative GPA? Or should I include my major GPA? Or should I include both? So as a general rule of thumb, you should only list your GPA on your resume if it's above a 3.0. And it's important to make sure that you specify the scale that the GPA is on. So not all universities have a GPA based on a 4.0 scale. It could be a 5-point scale. It could be a 9-point. It could even be a 12-point scale for grades. So it's important to specify the scale that the GPA is based upon. And so, listing a GPA can be helpful to show your work ethic and skills if you have little to no relevant work experience. The thing to be aware of is if you only list your major GPA, and basically those would be all of your NRRT and NR courses, because those are the courses that are taught within our college and within our department, then an employer might look at that and say, okay, well, your major GPA is a 3.5. What's your overall GPA, right? And if your overall GPA is a 2.9, that might raise some issues. So just be aware if you're just listing your major GPA, that question might come up through the job interview process or something like that. Another thing is to typically you're not going to list high school athletics or clubs or organizations. Now you would only want to list these if they're directly relevant to the job you're applying for in terms of skills, or if you want to show teamwork or leadership. A lot of times I think early in a student's college career, this is all they have is their high school stuff. But if you're a junior or senior in college, especially if you're getting ready to graduate, what employers are going to want to see is what have you done since you've been in college. And so, if all you're listing is high school stuff and you're a senior in college, or you're listing a lot of high school stuff and only a little bit of stuff from college, that can raise some issues. So again, only list stuff if it's relevant to the job you're applying for. And avoid having this laundry list of awards, all these different sports or things you lettered in, that sort of thing. Again, the farther away you get from high school, really not that relevant anymore. If you are mailing a hard copy of your resume and cover letter, or you're hand delivering it or giving it to somebody, you shouldn't fold your resume and cover letter, but put them in an envelope that will hold them easily. So a 9-inch by 12-inch envelope is large enough to hold 8.5 by 11-inch size piece of paper. As far as the paper goes, try to get something that's a little thicker than regular printer paper. It can be white, maybe an off-white. Don't go with really extreme colors. Something that's a bond or maybe a textured paper. Sometimes these are called linen style of paper. You can usually pick these up at office supply stores, Office Depot, something like that. It may be appropriate, if you're in natural resources, to have maybe a tree or a mountain scene on the paper in the background as a watermark, or maybe a little graphic element on the side or the corner or something like that. Don't put any staples, no paper clips, no binders, nothing like that. And that's because a lot of times when you drop off a hard copy or mail it to them, they're probably going to scan it, and they may scan it to share it with other people. They may scan it to run it through a software application to look for keywords. We'll talk about that here in just a moment. So you want to make sure it's just plain paper. A lot of people wonder about the 2-page versus 1-page, or should it be even longer than that? In most cases, for entry-level jobs, either while you're still in college or if you've recently graduated, a 1-page should be sufficient. Now, the exception to this would be if you have extensive, directly relevant experience, or if you're applying for a federal job, then a federal resume is much longer because it lists everything you've done. It includes your high school education, contact information for employers. I mean, there's a lot more information on there. And if you go on the Career Center's website and look underneath some of those tools, or just do a search for federal resume. You'll see lots of good examples of that. So if you find that your resume goes on to a second page, but it's only partly on the next page, really work on the font size and the margins to try to get it onto one page. As a general rule of thumb, if you're going to do a two-page resume, it's best if you completely fill up both pages. But sometimes you just can't do it, and that's okay. Just it looks better if you can completely fill up both pages. Sometimes people ask about, how should I include volunteer experience versus real experience? My recommendation on that is just have a section called experience and list all the experience that's relevant to the job you're applying for. You might even call it relevant experience in that section. But if it's a volunteer position, make sure you put the word volunteer so they know it wasn't a paid position. If it's volunteer experience that's not relevant to the job you're applying for, then you can include it under another heading called volunteer experience. Sometimes people want to put their supervisor's name and contact information. This information is not necessary on a resume. The only time you would include it is if you're applying for a federal government job or sometimes many state government jobs. But if the job announcement specifically says to include this information on your resume, then of course you would include that. Now, as you go through the application process, they may request contact information from previous employers, and that might be after the first cut of going through the resumes, or could be after the first round of interviews or something like that. So, but that is information that most employers are going to want to ask for at some point. Okay, so I mentioned before about using software to scan and look for words in a resume. These are commonly known as applicant tracking system software applications. And so if you know for sure that a company is using an ATS, and if you don't know for sure, you can email them, call them, or ask them. It's important to construct your resume so it's friendly to this particular software. And so what you're trying to do is maximize your hit potential. So keywords are really important. The words that show up at the top of the job announcement, and especially if certain words or phrases show up a lot, those need to appear at least once, if not several times in your resume, and preferably towards the top. Make sure to use web standard fonts, so no cursive fonts, something like an Arial, a Calibri, Times New Roman, something like that. And avoid fancy formatting, because if you've got stuff all over the page, it's really hard for the software to pick up sometimes those words. And so the reason why companies will use applicant tracking systems these days is because for especially large companies, in some cases, they will get hundreds or even thousands of resumes for a single opening. And so having the software go through the resumes for the first cut saves a lot of human time, right? So that you don't have people looking through thousands of resumes. I think this is still somewhat rare in the typical employment fields that students in the natural resource tourism and human dimensions of natural resources majors, but nonetheless, it could be something that's used. And so again, you can contact the organization to see if they use something like this to make sure that you maximize the scannability of your resume. So this article here that was in Biz Journal, the business journals, it's 8 ways to please the robot masters that are reading your resume. And so again, it gives a little bit of background on why applicant tracking systems are used. There's an infographic here that walks you through it. And so this is some good tips and tricks on how to make the resume more scanner friendly for these systems. Okay, so sometimes people ask, what's a curriculum vitae? And pretty much in the United States, what we call a resume, the rest of the world calls a curriculum vitae or CV. So if you're applying for a job overseas, abroad in another country, and they say to send your CV, that means your resume. Now, in the United States, however, a CV is typically the type of resume that a scientist or maybe a professor will use. And it is very, very detailed, and lists everything they've ever done, right? Every research project they've ever done, every article they've ever published, every class they've ever taught, on and on and on and on. So, for people that have been, say, a professor for 30 years, their CV might be 100, 120 pages long, right? So just understand kind of, the United States versus the rest of the world. What does a curriculum vitae mean? Now, sometimes organizations request that a resume and cover letter be sent within the text of an email. This isn't as common as it used to be, but more likely it's going to be as an attachment to the email. If you are putting your cover letter and resume in the body of an email, it's important to avoid any special codes or formatting. So it's going to look pretty plain. Use spaces instead of tabs, and then make sure to hit the return button at the end of each line, and you should have 60 characters per line maximum. So those includes letters, spaces, punctuation, things like that. And then send that email to yourself to check how it looks. But again, this is not very common anymore. Pretty much, most organizations now can easily handle attachments, but there still might be some out there that request this. So sending it as an attachment, it's a best practice to save your files as a PDF. If you're using Microsoft Word to send it to somebody else, make sure you use standard fonts and avoid graphics. Somebody might have an older version of Word. If you're on a PC and they have a Mac, they might have different fonts installed in their version of Word. So, using standard fonts. So again, things like Calibri, Times New Roman, Helvetica, things like that, the fairly common fonts. And then don't use an email message as a cover letter. Send a separate cover letter as an attachment, just like your resume is attached. And then when you go to the job interview, if you're going in person, take at least one additional hard copy of your resume, and maybe 2 or 3. If you know several people are going to be interviewing you, they may not have your resume right in front of them, so it's good to bring some extra copies with you to give to them. If it's a telephone interview or a video interview, say via Skype or something like that, make sure you've got a copy in front of you so you can reference it during the job interview. Okay, so now we're going to look at 5 different resumes, and here are some things I want you to be thinking about as we look through these. What do you see that looks good? And I'll mention some things here and there. What do you see that maybe isn't so good? Do you see any errors? Okay. Do you see any missing information? Or maybe do you see some unnecessary or irrelevant or maybe incorrect information? So, these are things when I grade the cover letter and resume assignment, these are some of the things I'm going to be looking for. What about the layout and design? Does it have a good feel to it? Can you find information easily, or is it hard to find information? Does it look kind of weird? And then maybe what kind of ideas do you have for improvement? The more different styles of resumes that you look at, the better an idea you will have of what you feel fits you and what you think looks the best. And so I also want you to be thinking about, how does your resume stack up to these examples? So let's take a look here. And so here's our first resume. And up at the top, we've got contact information. We have a professional profile with bulleted statements. And we've got some active verbs, some concrete nouns here. They've abbreviated NGO. I mean, us in natural resources, we know, or most of us should know what NGO, non-governmental organization, stands for, so I think that's fine. We've got the type of degree, a BS, the name of the degree, the university, some of the courses that they've taken. Notice that these are just the course titles. They're not the course prefix or number. The prefix or number for a course is irrelevant, so you just want to have the course title. And then we've got relevant experience and projects. So going through here and talking about, what they did, and a couple bullets for each item. We've got the dates off to the side. And these were seasonal positions, so they just said fall or summer. That's pretty easy to understand. Work experience. So we've got, these are kind of pulled together. So here's an example where this person has been a server at 3 different locations or restaurants, and they did pretty much the same job duties at each one, so they just lumped them all together, right, with the dates off to the side, even though they were different employers. And then we've got some other jobs that they've had here, and then down at the bottom, some additional information that they feel is important for the employer to know in terms of, volunteer work they've done. They worked on an honors project. They participated in the Leave No Trace workshop. So, this one overall I think is laid out nice visually. It's easy to find information, and I think overall it's a very good resume. Okay, so the next one here, this is actually from an older version, I think, of Microsoft Word. This is a standard resume template they used to have in there. Not sure if they have it in there anymore. But we've got an objective statement. We've got some experience listed here, and so we've got the dates first, and then the employer and location. But the job titles are in bold, so those are easy to see. And we've got several bullets after each job title. Something to keep in mind here is when you've got bullets like this, you don't need to put punctuation after a bullet. It's not necessary to do that. I think it looks better if you don't have punctuation when you're using bullets. We've got the education here. We've got the dates, the name of the university. This person listed their concentration. They had an academic accolade here, being on the dean's list. Interest and activities, and then some certifications, and we've got expiration dates on here. So this is another thing. If you have any sort of certifications or trainings that expire, it's important to list the expiration date on your resume, because the employer needs to know, is that a current thing that you possess, or is it something that's going to expire soon? If a training has expired, then do not list it on your resume, because then the employer is going to say, well, why do I want to hire you if you don't have that training, But you could say in your cover letter, I have been certified in first aid CPR. It just recently expired, and I'm planning on getting recertified here in the next month. So that's okay. Okay, here's another sample resume. Big name up at the top. We've got contact information off to the side. Maybe it might look better if it was here in the middle. We've got an objective statement. We've got a summary, 3 bulleted items about what this person, who they are, what they want to do, maybe a little bit the name of their degree, expected to graduate with a certain GPA. Okay, well, you might just want to say, what is your GPA right now, not what you're expected to graduate with. Courses taken, a little bit of maybe an alignment issue here with these 2 items at the bottom of the education section. Experience, so we've got job titles, dates, locations, 2 or 3 bullets for each job, and I think this one's pretty easy to read. Pretty large font, but it fills up the page nicely. Pretty easy to read. Okay, let's go down to the next one. Oh wait, we've got a second page here. Look at this. Okay, so this one goes on to a second page, and notice that there are some phrases, some sentences here where they're using the first person. So you could say the same thing without using the first person. And really, having statements where you're talking about yourself as a person, that should be something that either goes in the cover letter, or that's really information that should be saved for the job interview. That's really not relevant information to have on a resume. You could talk about your activities, but if you're talking about sort of my family instilled this in me, my goal is to do this, that's really, again, for the cover letter, or better yet, the job interview. Okay, and then again, here we have the second page, but we have a lot of white space. So could they conceivably fit everything on one page? Probably, by decreasing the font size. They could decrease the margins on the sides and the top, so they could probably fit everything on there under one page. All right, so the next one here, we've got some contact information up top, got a line that goes across, got their education, their major, their minor, employment experience, so we've got job titles, locations, dates, bullets, we've got active verbs describing what they did, leadership experience, You know, a little bit of white space down here, you know, these things are kind of squished together a little bit, so maybe it could have been spread out a little more on the page from top to bottom, but overall pretty well formatted. And the next one here, you know, what strikes me about this one is font's a little bit small. The smallest size you want to go for your font is 10. I'm guessing this is probably 10 in terms of font size, so it's probably okay. If you are applying for a job internationally, you want to make sure that you put USA, and also for your phone number, you want to make sure you put a 1 in front of the phone number because that's a country code for the United States. So I see it a lot when students apply for international jobs, they'll forget to put USA and or they'll forget to put a 1 in front of the area code for their phone number. So this particular student, we've got an objective statement. You know, we've got their degree here, the major and the minor. We've got some relevant courses listed, skills and abilities. So this is what we would call a functional style of resume. So instead of listing their jobs in reverse chronological order, they've chosen to list these skill or functional areas or abilities and then have bullets underneath each one, and you know, kind of says how they acquired that experience or what they did to, you know, to demonstrate that they've got that skill or ability or function. And then down below we have the experience, but it's just very brief. And there's no job duties here because the job duties are up here in this skills, abilities, or underneath these functional headings. So this is another style of resume, and it takes a little bit more work to put something like this together. The functional style resume is best for someone who doesn't have a lot of directly relevant experience, but they have transferable experience. So either someone who's just graduating from college or if someone's transferring from one career field to another. Okay, so we've looked at those resumes, and this concludes Module 5, Part 2.